You know, I'm gonna leave. We gotta stop and fight the fight. Whether we're gonna merge, whether we're gonna file bankruptcy, whatever we're gonna do, you need to be informed so you can make an intelligent decision. She's not here to get a contract from the city. I just want to know, so she understands bankruptcy, municipal bankruptcies. Shed some light for all of us so we can make an intelligent decision.
May I suggest before you yield to her? You can call, get two, you're the vice president.
Yeah.
Well, you still need another person to call, two other people to call a meeting and have the discussion and send the notices out to all the council members. You can have a meeting of this nature, but it cannot be go into an executive session. It has to be public because we're talking about the affairs of the city, and it has to be public. And secondly, so I have to go on to say this: no public official, elected person can go into executive session to discuss whatever happens to that person and open to the public because they are a public figure. So the law says they cannot go into an executive session.
Thank you.
So, sure.
So the three people that's here.
No problem whatsoever. All right, so I'm going to dive in. You all will tell me if you have questions, and I'm sure that you will.
Can you say your name again?
Sure. My name is Sherri Dahl. I'm a partner at Renzel and Andrus. If somebody were walking on the street and we stopped to chat, I'd say, I'm a bankruptcy attorney. Okay. I've been practicing bankruptcy law for the last 12, 13 years. Started my career out of law school, clerking for a bankruptcy judge, have spent 100% of my legal work time representing debtors in bankruptcy, representing banks, representing creditors committees and individual creditors. I'm rare in that I've represented all the major parties. Usually a bankruptcy attorney tends to focus on one particular type of client. I've done them all. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've spent a lot of my own personal time, meaning not only my work time, but my free time, researching, reading, writing, and attending court hearings and meetings and seminars specifically focused on municipal insolvency. Because I learned through my practice that this is an area where there aren't a lot of people practicing. There are literally a handful of bankruptcy attorneys in the country who know anything at all about municipal insolvency. And the laws that govern cities, towns, villages, and their insolvency issues are very different from the traditional corporate or Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So Chapter 9 is very different from Chapter 11. And it's counterintuitive sometimes, which is one of the reasons I'm thrilled to be here this evening, because over the past several weeks, months, I've seen the headlines about East Cleveland. I'm not from East Cleveland. I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio. I've been working in downtown Cleveland for the past 12, 13 years. And I just, in the last year, moved to Bracknell, so I live just a couple miles away on Quaid Road in Bracknell. So I'm not familiar, other than what I've read online, with the history of this city. But I did spend significant time over the holidays reading about East Cleveland. And I read a lot. I watched YouTube videos. I'm grateful for the fact that you record your meetings. It gave me great insight into the thinking that's going on, but I'm not going to even pretend to know the details about what you all are dealing with. I could talk for hours on this subject. I don't think that would be helpful to you necessarily. I really like to address questions. So before I sort of launch into stuff, do you have specific questions that you'd like to ask me?
What are the bankruptcy options as far as 9, 11, 13? I'm sorry, the municipality or city, local government, do they have the option of all of those, or
No.
they can do Chapter 9?
Chapter 9.
And Chapter 9 is what?
Chapter 9 is a part of the bankruptcy code that is specifically put together just to address municipalities. The definition of what a municipality is important to you. You fit it, okay? okay? So Chapter 9 is where you would fit if you were to file bankruptcy. The important thing to remember about Chapter 9, the thing that most people won't realize unless they've looked carefully into it. I think most people's understanding of bankruptcy is probably built around what happens when a person files bankruptcy. So we all have this general understanding that when a person files bankruptcy, they start with a certain amount of debt, and the understanding is, whether it's a Chapter 7 or whether it's a Chapter 13, they exit bankruptcy with less debt than they had when they started. That's our general understanding of how a person or a company, in certain regards, deal with bankruptcy. It's very different when a city enters bankruptcy. It's not fair to say that a city is going to be able to file bankruptcy and then simply wipe out a bunch of debt and exit bankruptcy free of that debt. It's not that simple. It is generally that simple for a person. It is not that simple for a city. Why, you might ask? What's the difference? Well, when the bankruptcy code is set up, and I can go on and I can go into great detail or not, but generally speaking, the federal government, bankruptcy law is federal law. So federal bankruptcy law allows individuals and companies to breach contracts, okay? Most of your debt, if you're an individual person or you're a company, most of your debt is based on a contract. So you can enter bankruptcy, you can breach the contract by basically not paying what you said you would have paid in the first place. When you have a city filing bankruptcy, the federal law does not allow the federal government or the bankruptcy law to allow you to break contracts. Right, so the federal constitution and the state constitution don't allow the federal government to just wipe out contracts. So that's where municipal insolvency gets very different. It has to be very different from when a company or an individual person files bankruptcy. Normally, if a person or a company files bankruptcy, the bankruptcy court is in charge, and when I say in charge, what I really mean is they oversee or they have to approve the way all the money is spent. That doesn't happen when the city files for bankruptcy. When the city files for bankruptcy, the city still has full control over how they spend all of their money. For example, if a city files for bankruptcy, they can still pay debts that were due before the bankruptcy. When a company or a person files bankruptcy, they're not allowed to just freely pay debts that accrued before bankruptcy. There's a whole set of priority rules, and you actually can't pay debts that accrue before bankruptcy unless all the different creditors within a class get the same amount. That's not the way it works in municipal bankruptcy. In a municipal bankruptcy, yes, you file, and so you are able to basically stay any litigation that's against you. That's where bankruptcy is the same. But when it comes to deciding how to spend the money, you don't have the bankruptcy code telling you how you're allowed to spend your money for the debts that were before the bankruptcy. You as a city, you still have all the power to determine who gets paid and who doesn't get paid. Now, where what I'm saying is changed slightly is if you go all the way through a bankruptcy and you get to the end, a city would have to file a plan. And the plan, once it's approved by a bankruptcy court, becomes literally what it sounds like, the way the city operates after bankruptcy. In a plan, you can, either through negotiated agreement or by getting the, well, it's basically, you got to do it through negotiated agreement. You can, through negotiated agreement, put into a plan that you are not paying people in full. But I have to stress, it really has to be by negotiated agreement. So you've heard recently, I mean, what most of us think of when we think of a city filing bankruptcy is Detroit, because that's what's happened most recently. Detroit's plan was approved by the court, but all the information in the plan about who was going to get paid and how much, and what kind of extra revenue they were going to all of that had to be determined by agreement. So it's the plan, which gets you out of bankruptcy, is a bunch of negotiated agreements. So this is where I really want, if you don't remember anything I say today but this, I want you to remember this one thing. Anything that you can accomplish in bankruptcy, you can probably accomplish it outside of bankruptcy, because we are talking about negotiated agreements with lots of different parties. Why is that important to remember? Because bankruptcy is expensive. I try to keep track of all the big bankruptcies and important bankruptcies, including Detroit. I've been following that closely. The fees for professionals in the Detroit bankruptcy were more than $170 million. The legal fees alone for Jones Day, their primary lawyer, were $57 million, and that was for 16 months. So the reason bankruptcy gets very expensive is because once a city, or anyone really, but once a city files for bankruptcy, all your creditors, and sometimes politicians, but anyone who has a say or thinks they have an opinion about what you have done and why you've done it, they're going to get involved in that bankruptcy. There's going to be litigation in that bankruptcy. The first thing that's going to be litigated is, should you have filed? Were you authorized by law to file? The bankruptcy code provides that a city cannot file bankruptcy unless it's approved by the state. In the state of Ohio, there is a very, it's not fair to say poorly written, there's a vaguely written, there's a paragraph that is not simple to read, okay? And it says that the tax commissioner has to authorize bankruptcy. In the state of Ohio, the governor appoints the tax commissioner, so it's really the governor. The governor would have to approve a bankruptcy filing. Now let's just think practically for a minute.
Could we just pause right there?
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
I know you alluded to Detroit. Detroit system norms are set up totally different than Ohio deals with bankruptcy, which they have the authority to appoint. This is my label or adjective that I'm using, as a dictator. Ohio does not have that.
You mean the emergency manager?
The manager.
MR.
I just call it dictator.
Sure.
That's what he is. It usurped all of the authority from the people in Detroit.
Right.
And you can't come in.
I'm not in there.
Well, you can't stand in the door. You're still present. You're present.
Say bye.
I'm just trying to keep everything legal. You got it on tape up there and you're going to show it. I'm just trying to stay legal.
Right is
and
right.
keep you out of trouble.
Right is right.
As I was saying, Detroit, they appointed a dictator. You call him a manager. When you usurp the authority of the people, government is the people. And when you usurp that, that's what has happened in Detroit. They totally allowed them to, and I don't know why the federal government allowed that to happen in Detroit, to let somebody come in and governor to do what he did in reference to Detroit.
Pardon me, I'm sorry. When you all leave, Tracy's going out with me because she doesn't have to stay here. Can you all rearrange the tables?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good night.
So anyway,
No, Ohio doesn't have that power.
so Ohio doesn't have that. So I would appreciate if we stick with what the norms are in Ohio, and I know you began to elucidate in reference to some of the things that you go through as far as trying to enter into bankruptcy, because I cannot fathom in my finite mind whereas any municipality has filed bankruptcy in Ohio. You may have some records.
No, no municipality has ever filed bankruptcy in Ohio yet. There was
So
a time when Cleveland came very close, but they didn't file.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So in our approach to Chapter 9, not only will we have to incur the cost of litigation, which we would have to then hire outside attorneys to handle that, because we would need some expertise in dealing with municipal bankruptcy, but we may not necessarily be able to change the problem that causes us to have a structural deficit, which is mainly our union contracts. Unless they agree to those changes, there's nothing that can force them into accepting the changes that we believe are necessary.
You have to understand, as I answered that question, and I want to speak to what you said too. As I answer that question, you have to understand, I don't know any of the details about your union contracts. I don't know any of the details about your line item financial issues, okay? So I'm giving you a general answer.
Sure.
The general answer is, if the city were to file bankruptcy, you would ultimately, if you wanted to change a union contract, you would ultimately need to have discussion with the union leaders. You would have to have settlement discussions and try to peacefully negotiate a change. Could you ultimately, if you weren't able to have agreement, could you ask the judge to decide whether your changes or the union's recommended changes would win? Yes, you could ask the bankruptcy judge to make that choice.
But we're left to the decision of someone else, a third party.
Yeah, you would be left to the decision of a third party, a mediator or the bankruptcy judge, somebody with judicial powers could ultimately break a tie if there's two, ideas for how the union contract should be changed.
So our...
And the trend, let me just follow the trend, because California has had several municipal bankruptcies filed, and the trend has been for bankruptcy judges to make the changes in union or pension contracts that need to be made to balance your budget. I mean, there was a time when there's a big question mark about whether a bankruptcy judge would authorize revisions, but I am here to tell you the trend now is yes, they will.
Okay, because our issue isn't balancing the budget. That's not our issue.
Well,
so I know.
I'm using a crude way of
right.
saying you've got more expenses than you do revenue,
right.
and
so a third party will determine whether or not what we believe as an administration, as a city, what is important in terms of the changes that are necessary. We wouldn't necessarily have that power. We would have to put that in the hands of a third party.
Yeah, and I want to make really clear, they could decide. Doesn't mean they have to or they would,
right.
because the judge would have to decide whether they wanted to act like the judge in California acted when he made choices. You could have a bankruptcy judge here that decided they didn't want to make that choice. So you could have a completely different outcome here than what we've seen in other municipal bankruptcies. The bottom line, though, is it would be a very long process. It would not be quick, and it would be very expensive.
And we may not get the outcome that we were looking for in the first place.
To your question that you asked, the city experienced that during my tenure on the council, and we did negotiate with the unions, and we told the unions, we was up front, we don't have the money, so we can't give you something. Some of them went along with it and agreed with it. Some we went to court, and the court, as she just indicated, decided the factor. Don't have the money, can't pay you something we don't have. As long as we're paying you currently, when we do arise, we will reconsider that. But at the moment, we don't have it. So it takes negotiation start here. What you have done with the union. We brought them in, brought in all department heads, brought in the unions, and told them, we don't have the money, we can't give you raises, or whatever the case may be. And even with the what they call them, the mediator, it made that crystal clear with them. And so it went back
our issues is a bit different. So it's not about raises or anything. It's about, okay, this class of people won't get health insurance, or
Oh, well,
we're cutting pension contributions in half. We're talking about major, major, major changes. Not simply to balance a budget. We can lay off enough people to balance the budget, but to begin to have a revenues that we can use to fix a truck or to buy salt. We can do a balanced budget so that everybody will get paid, because all we have to do is reduce the amount of people. But in order to actually operate, to provide the necessary services, we would have to make structural changes, like all police department going completely part-time.
So let me ask you a question. Under that scenario, what happens if Cleveland was to say, we don't want to merge with you guys? What would happen? We have no money, and bankruptcy says you can't file bankruptcy because you can't afford bankruptcy. You can't afford the litigation that's going to be required. What happens?
That's a good question.
Very good question.
Because now, if another minister, and then say Cleveland didn't want us, Cleveland Heights took us. If Cleveland Heights take us, but they say, well, are they going to be obligated to pay off that debt that was outstanding?
We live in Brandon.
Guys,
Maybe Brandon.
may I?
No, we heard nothing.
I know, right? Do you mind if I
Go ahead,
say something?
yeah.
Because, what we wanted to kind of find out collectively is a little bit more about bankruptcy.
Right.
And the conversations about, well, what if Cleveland doesn't, in Cleveland Heights doesn't, those are other things that, maybe we could do them in a separate discussion.
Right. No, I was trying to give her the option of saying that if we had no choice, but bankruptcy.
Right. There's one question that I kind of wanted to ask, if you don't mind, to put us in the realm of bankruptcy and keeping with what it is. Now, I know that the laws in Ohio are different from the laws in Michigan. But just looking at the characteristics of the entity that goes into bankruptcy, for instance, Detroit, a huge city, versus us, a small city. From what I saw about cities in California, the thing that seems to me to be a similarity between other cities and other states, and a difference, that something different about East Cleveland. The other cities I see had pension systems where the city, namely Detroit, paid the monthly pension payments to their retirees after they left the employ of Detroit. So when they retired, Detroit itself still paid them their pension payments. Detroit itself still paid their health care. And I understand that there's similarities with the California cities. They also had something where after the employee retired, the city was still responsible for paying that former employee's stuff. In East Cleveland and in Ohio, fortunately, our cities have the public employees retirement system, the state retirement system. Once the employee retires from us, we are no longer responsible for any pension payments. We're no longer responsible for any health care payments. Now, to me, that's a huge difference because there are not that many future obligations that we have to current employees, or future obligations that we have to employees once retired, they're gone. But those costs are huge for those other cities. And what I'm getting at, and there's also debt, a separate issue is debt. Detroit had billions of dollars in debt.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions, but they had billions of dollars in debt. We have $2 million, and it's less like structured over time debt. It's more like we owe past due payables to a set number of companies in the amount of $2 to $3 million. So given that those other places had tremendous costs that could be eaten into over time, East Cleveland probably has a smaller pool of costs that can be restructured under bankruptcy. So would you talk just a little bit about an entity that enters bankruptcy or approaches bankruptcy that has a huge burden of debt versus an entity like East Cleveland that has a couple $1 million in debt?
Yeah, you raise an important point, because when you think about when bankruptcy is necessary for a municipality, in all of my research and all of my reading, which is similar to yours, it makes sense for a city to file bankruptcy when you have big pension liabilities, big union liabilities that are the way the mayor has described it. And you have future ongoing monthly after people retire responsibilities and huge bond debt that needs to be restructured. The reason bankruptcy makes sense in those scenarios, not only because the numbers are so large, okay, but the kind of debt we're talking about when we're talking about retirees and health care benefits and bond debt, we're talking about debt where you can't just get in a room around a table with a couple of people and work out a deal. You know, when you are dealing with thousands and tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of retirees and the checks they're going to get in their mailbox every month, you have to go into bankruptcy to resolve that issue because you need a federal judge to issue an order that says it's okay for you to do what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to litigate, and Detroit is still litigating. Even though they are technically out of bankruptcy because their plan was approved, they are still getting appeals to that plan related to the retiree benefits. So, again, it made sense for Detroit to file because of the pension and the health care and the huge bond debt. In my opinion, it is less reasonable for a city that doesn't have those issues to file because you may think that you're entering a situation where you're going to rid yourself of a bunch of debt, but you're not. Okay? You have to work out deals with your creditors if you file bankruptcy. You could try to work out these deals outside of bankruptcy. Now, you should understand bankruptcy and how it works so that you can use the threat of bankruptcy as leverage. And I'm going to touch on something that I haven't heard any of you ask me about, but I think it's important for you to start thinking about, and that is what can the state do, if anything, to help you? I've heard you talk about the county, and it's good to hear that you're tapping into the resources you have with getting approvals, and you know, I understand the deal that worked out with the zone trucks, okay? There may be something that the state can do, and I don't know whether it's a one-time help for you or whether it's longer term than that, but there is a political issue right now based on your local government funds and how they've been reduced. I'm going to speak about Detroit for a moment, but in Detroit, if you read summaries of their bankruptcy plan, you'll see again and again and again that the state of Michigan and private contributors put together $800 million in revenue for the city. We're not seeing in these published accounts how much of that was state money and how much of that was private contributors. I'd be very interested to know how much the state contributed to help Detroit get out of bankruptcy. So you might want to think about what kind of deals you can strike with the state. Other than that, you're going to want to negotiate with all of your creditors. It's better for them to take a reduced amount. You can do that by agreement. I know you're doing other things already. You got to think about how to monetize your assets. I don't know what all your assets are, but if you have buildings, if you have land.
We already did it.
All right. Well, there's a lot of different options that you have. I think you should be thinking about not only cutting, which I know you're doing. I know you're cutting yourselves to the bone. You got to think about how to get more revenue, and whether that's through state, county. There are some options you should explore there.
Well, you know, I think, I know we can go on with this for hours.
Yeah.
Because this is not a quick fix at all.
Right.
I don't mean this is just part one. Many more series to come. Unless anybody else have any other questions, I'm sure we'll be dialoguing over the next few weeks. But
Mr. Vice President, with you two in particular, I just
don't
want
blame me.
No, if you have exhausted all of your questions, because we've talked a bit, and she's here. Have you two exhausted all your questions, and then Sherri is, and I don't mean to try and wrap up your meeting for you, but Sherri, there might be some things that we didn't ask about that you might think of for a small city.
Sure. I do want to follow up with something that you said earlier about how Detroit is very different in the way that their law works. It is, but it also doesn't have to be, because in Michigan they put a law on the ballot related to the emergency manager, and it failed. Okay, people didn't vote for it. So the executive branch put together the law and passed the law without the vote of people, which made it possible for the emergency manager to be appointed by the governor. And I think, I'm not absolutely sure about this, but I think the state paid Kevin Orr's salary and Jonas Day's fees. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I think the state played a role in paying for some of Detroit bankruptcy professional fees. That law, though, was passed right before the bankruptcy was filed. And so in the state of Ohio, something similar to that could happen if, if the state determined that they wanted East Cleveland in bankruptcy, then the state could pass a law making it so that the governor could do something to make bankruptcy more likely for you. Now, this is where we get into politics. I've heard through the grapevine, I don't think it's a secret, the governor wants to run for president. The auditor who's involved with your fiscal emergency commission, he's going to be running for another office. And one of the things that struck me as I was reading about you folks over the holidays was the auditor is doing a lot of public speaking about East Cleveland and your financial situation. I haven't talked to the auditor. I don't know what his thoughts are. I don't know what his plan is, but you've got to think about the politics of people's aspirations for where they want to be next. And the state actually could, if they wanted to, lean on you, and they could play a role that I don't know if they're playing it now. I don't know how the state's involved, but look, I have a lot of friends who are in the state, and I think the governor is thinking about East Cleveland right now. I think that there are discussions happening, so you folks need to decide what you want to do, and if you don't decide what your plan for the future is, and if you don't make your plan for the future something that the public knows about, in that void, in that vacuum, others will do it for you.
And right, and I said, closed mouth never fed. And I think that the state will intervene in our situation. And as you just alluded to, the fact that those people are expiring for different positions, or someone want to keep their positions, etc. And we are electors of the state, and so we do vote, so we do count, and I think that if somebody open their mouth and go with the united front, not stagnant, go as a body, elected body, and discuss these issues and get an audience with the governor and what have you, bring all the players to the table and discuss. I think the governor and and could start with our state reps that we elected, and they can open those doors to get into the governor and an audience with our elected officials in Columbus to aid and assist the city. And that's my take on that. But we got to be together.
There's a lot of things that can be done here, and it has to do with communications and meetings and deals, and that's what I do every day. So I'm happy to talk about it anytime you want.
I don't know if I know deals, but I would negotiate. I think from that perspective. Like deals.
No, I'm fine. She gonna write us a check.
Right.
Like that better?
Right.
I'd like to thank you for coming out. I'm not closing the meeting by any means, but I felt the need to say something. So thank you for coming out, and I'm not sure if it's possible that once we get the other counselors to sit through some sort of education 101 on this, if you'd be willing to come back. And for clarity, I understand that you said that you've been on both sides of a number of bankruptcies. Now, have you been on either side of Chapter 9?
Let me explain that to you in my experience. So I have been a bankruptcy attorney my whole legal career since I clerked for the bankruptcy judge. I work for Retzel now, and I started working for Retzel in February of 2014. before I worked for Retzel, I was an attorney at Squire Sanders for 8.5 years, and another firm before that for 2 years. But while I was at Squire Sanders, I spent a lot of my time advising our city clients and special purpose client authorities, which are also municipalities for the most part, on bond documents. And so it would be my job, the public finance people would draft a bond document. They would want me to give advice on, the paragraph of the bond document that deals with municipal insolvency and the likelihood of it ever being filed in that particular situation. I advised a client at Squire Sanders that was involved with the Detroit bankruptcy. We represented a party that was a government entity, an authority entity that was involved with monetizing some of the Detroit assets, so I have been involved with the Detroit bankruptcy. I have also advised cities outside of bankruptcy, because as you can tell, a lot of my advice is don't file, okay? Do everything you can and don't file. So I've talked to clients who are not in bankruptcy that are municipal entities. That's my experience.
Let me ask you one question in reference to the bond. Do you think that the bond market would accept us now if we had the door of bankruptcy? I don't think we could even go to the bond market.
I'm not a bond attorney, so I'm not the best person to give you advice on that. So I'm gonna take a pass on it straight out. But I will tell you that Detroit, restructured its bond debt while in bankruptcy. So generally you can work things out. It just depends on what it costs you.
Mr. VP, do you mind one question for me?
There's a question behind me.
But one for me.
You, the mayor go, then you go.
I spoke with another attorney, and he's also a mayor for another city. And
I probably know who you're talking about.
yeah, you do.
Because I think I used to work for him.
Oh, really?
At
Okay.
McDonald Hopkins?
Huh?
At McDonald Hopkins?
Yes, you got it.
That was my first job.
Oh yeah?
Law
Well, he
school.
seemed like a great guy, very knowledgeable.
Yes, yes.
And he talked to me about this, and he said to me, I don't think that he asked him for a meeting. He came to the office and said, looking at your situation, I don't think that bankruptcy would be the best thing for you. And this is a bankruptcy attorney. I said, I don't think it would be the best thing for you. I'm just going to be honest. So we talked a little bit more, and he said, then at the end he said, I really don't think that bankruptcy would be the best thing for you. And then we talked about just a company's bankruptcy. He said, as a bankruptcy attorney,
Which is where he spends most of his time.
right?
Yeah.
And he said the general principles being the same or as similar as you could get in between a city and an individual company. He said, look, when he sees a business owner struggling who wants to enter bankruptcy and save his business, he says, look, you could go through all this, and he did say you could spend a ton of money and a ton of time, and at the end of it, have your struggling company that you might resurrect, or you might not. But a better service that he has offered from time to time is selling the company to a larger entity that could make the investments that are needed to make it stronger, and then the owner of the former company owns a percentage of the new company. And he put it like this: would you rather go through all of this, spend a bunch of money, and have a bankrupt company, under-resourced, under-capitalized, or would you rather own 20% of a very successful company that has the resources you need? Similar thing, saying you go through bankruptcy, you spend a lot of money, and in the end, it may not be worth it. Don't enter bankruptcy. I mean, that's from what I got. East Cleveland's set of circumstances is not as big or as specific as you would want to put something into a bankruptcy ideally.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree with that assessment. It's the problems that you have, and I don't even know all the problems that you have, okay? But the little bit that I've been reading about, the little bit that's public, I don't think that your problems are best solved in bankruptcy. And you need to restructure, but that's something that can be done outside of bankruptcy. Probably.
And
My crystal
that's
ball's not working, but probably.
And that's without prodding and without much prior conversation between me. I just wanted to know, what was that advice like?
Brothers have one
I
question.
agree.
They're gonna be watching this tape, and they probably want to know who you are, how to reach you, because they might want to hire you.
Sure. So again, my name is Sherri Dahl. I'm at Retzel and Andrus. My telephone number is on the internet. It's 216-820-4241. People call me all the time to ask a lot of questions.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in. Sorry it took us so long.
But miscellaneous phone calls, just because they're related to East Cleveland, you won't try and bill us.
You're gonna get a bunch of those.
Look, as far as I'm concerned,